Well, happy Easter, everyone. My name is Michael Boehm. I'm one of the pastors here at Cedarbrook, and I'm excited for Easter. I love Easter. Easter's my favorite because we get to hear the Easter story. Do you know the Easter story involves the entire story of the Bible? We get to put it all together. It's all about this God who wants human beings to flourish and wants to partner with them to help them to flourish as his prized possession, and then how human beings, well, we fail to gain that life that God has for us, and then about God's solution to that problem, how God is going to partner with human beings to solve the problem and restore that life back to us, the life that he wanted us to have from the very beginning. It's an amazing story. I love it. I love telling the story, and I can't wait to tell it. So if you're ready, well, even if you're not ready, I'm going to tell the story. And in every good story, you start at the beginning. And at the beginning of the story, you've got to pay special attention to a few words that are being said because it's going to affect the rest of the story. So here we go. Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1, right at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Two major things to pick up on here. That there's this God that sees this chaos going on and speaks. And when this God speaks, what does his voice do? It creates life. Life comes into being through God's spoken words. And when God speaks and this life is created, did you pick up on that God also sees things? God sees things that are good. You ever stop and wonder, what about this light is so good? Or in the following verses, as God is speaking things into being and land is coming up, and he says that is good, and plants are growing up, and that is good. What about that is so good? It's all focused on the pinnacle of God's creation, his very special treasure. The one creation that he says, this creation is going to represent me. This creation is going to be like me. It's all about human beings flourishing. All of this is good because this is the place where human beings are going to have this life with God, partnered with God and one another. What a beautiful thing, right? Beautiful creation. But these human beings, they also need a place to flourish, a place to live. And so God plants this garden and places these human beings in this garden for them to work and for them to eat off of these trees that have just such great fruit. It's just like dropping down out of the trees, and they just can eat it at any time they want to. And God plants a tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of life. They get to eat from this tree and experience life with God and partnering perfectly together with one another forever and ever and ever. This is a good life, yeah? But God knows that they're going to need some instruction too. If they're going to rule and reign along with God and perfectly partnered with each other, they need some instruction. So God plants this tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden. And God gives them some instruction, some words he's going to speak. And when God speaks words, it creates life, right? So these words are instructions about life, the kind of life that these humans can flourish. So when God speaks and says, eat from all the trees in the garden, including the tree of life, but there's one tree that you can't just take for yourself. This one tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if you take from that tree, you'll die. God's words are about guiding them to life, not to death, right? So if they could just not take from that tree. Now, maybe as we hear this story, if you've never read this story before, maybe you've read it several times, and there's this little question in your brain of like, well, why wouldn't God think it's good that they would have the knowledge of good and evil? Wouldn't that be necessary for them to have? But we miss that God did give them an interpretation of what is good, right? He instructed them, don't eat from that tree. Don't just take from it for yourself. God is going to interpret for them what's good so they can experience the life that God has for them to where they can flourish. Seems good, right? Such a good thing. And that little question in our brain about, I wonder how good God is if he's maybe holding back on that tree a little bit. Well, that enters in a new character in this story. One that they call this serpent. I like to give the serpent a different name, actually. I call him a con artist. Because if any good con, they like to prey upon people that they feel that they can manipulate and they can trick with a question that gives them an illusion of power, gives them an illusion of control over their own life. It puts them in the place that they know best, and that's exactly what this con artist does. He comes in and he speaks to this woman in the garden, and the question is actually ridiculous when you think about it. The question is, did God really say not to eat any of the trees in the garden? Right? Not to eat from any of them? Why is that ridiculous? Because if they don't eat from it, what's going to happen? They'll die. Or what I think is even worse, they're going to become hangry. And then there's all kinds of chaos in the garden then, right? You know what that's like. So the question doesn't even make sense, but yet it's enough to give the illusion of power, an illusion of control to Eve in the garden that she takes the bait. And she says, of course we can eat from the trees, but there's just one tree that we can't eat from. We can't even touch it or we're going to die. And right there, that's when that con artist knows he has her. And he says, he won't die. God knows that if you eat from that tree, you're going to know and have the knowledge of good and evil. You're going to be just like God. You won't need God anymore to determine what's good for your life. You get to decide that for yourself. He's holding back on you. He doesn't want what's best for you. He doesn't have your best interest in mind or your best life for you. It seems silly, doesn't it? If you're standing there and you're hearing the story, you just can't help but to go like, Eve, wake up. He's trying to trick you. Just ask God, right? Just ask God. He'll tell you. Or maybe, talk to the other human that's there in the garden with you that knows, right? Talk together, work together in a partnership, but they don't. Instead, something bad happens. Because as we think about this story, we might be able to think in our mind about how this could really be a bad deal. We know what it's like when people have chosen to do bad things, when they made bad choices in their life and it's causing destruction for themselves and those around them. We know that the words that they speak are just hurtful, and they're really damaging not only to others, but even the words that they speak to themselves. Like, we can pick up on that. We know that can't be good, and yet somehow they can be blinded to that. But that's not the real problem, actually. Identifying what we can see as bad is bad enough, but there's something more subtle, something far more sinister at work. And I can't help but to point it out to you from Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, where Eve has her moment and reveals that sinister problem. The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. At that moment, their eyes were open and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. What's that subtle, sinister thing going on there? It's what voice Eve and Adam they listened to. Not just the serpent, but the own voice in their head that says, yeah, I think what God said would bring death will actually bring me life if I just take it for myself. I'm going to decide what a good life is. I don't need God for that. I'm going to live life my way. I'm going to determine what's good and what's bad. And right away we see what happens with these two humans. In all of their great wisdom that they just gained, their eyes being opened like they can see clearly now, what do they do to cover this thing that brings them shame? What do they do to their bodies? As they're walking around naked, they start seeing one another, and each one is interpreting what's good in their own eyes. And they're ashamed. They're too vulnerable. They're unprotected from the other person. Now, how are they going to interpret what I think is good? Maybe they think it's bad. Or what I think is bad for them is good for me type of idea, right? And so in their great wisdom, with their eyes wide open, what do? They sew fig leaves together to cover their nakedness. Does anybody realize how foolish that is? Honestly, have you ever touched a fig leaf? It's rough, and it has an oil on it that causes irritation. In their great wisdom, they sewed fig leaves together and created itchy underwear. That's what the Bible says. That's the extent of human wisdom when they do it on their own, right? It's so limited. We think this is good, it's going to cover us, and it doesn't. But the problem remains. Now that they've taken that for themselves and they can decide what's good for themselves, and that is going to compete against each other, this world is just going to start going back into chaos. Someone needs to solve this problem. Someone needs to do something. Someone needs to interfere. Somebody needs to deal with this con artist that started this thing in motion. Someone needs to deal with that echo chamber in these humans' minds about them deciding what's good for themselves and not seeing that it's actually bringing destruction for other people. Sure, it might look like a good life, but you're missing out on the life that God has for you, one that he wants you to flourish in. Someone needs to deal with that. And the good news is God's going to deal with that. And he's going to deal with that, not outside of the humans, but to draw them in once again, to partner with them, to help to be a part of the solution to the problem. Here's how he does this very poetically in Genesis 3, verse 15. He talks to this con artist, to this serpent, and here's what he says. I will cause hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And with any type of poetry, you kind of got to unpack it a little bit, and you got to sit with it, and what's really being said here. If the whole issue is that these human beings have taken something for themselves, decided that they can decide what's good and determine what's good for themselves, how do you undo that? How do you intervene? How do you quiet the voice of the con artist that is bringing chaos into this world? Well, God decides that the way to do that is to partner with human beings, and a human being that will offer up their life to quiet the serpent. See, that's what's being said here. If this human being is going to crush the head of this con artist, then he's also going to be killed by the con artist. It's going to be his own downfall. So who will be that human that's going to partner with God, listening to God's voice to bring about the end of this con artist? That's what they're waiting for. From the next chapters on, that's all they're wondering. Like, who's going to be the one that's going to say, I'm going to give up what I think is good about my life? Listen to God about the life that he has for me, even if that means death. And that will bring restoration to his good world. Who's going to do it? Adam and Eve, they have kids. Cain and Abel, are they going to be one that's going to offer up their life? If you know that story at all, that didn't work at all, right? Cain and Abel, two brothers, one gets mad at the other, and the way that he thinks is good to solve the problem is to get rid of his brother, to kill him. How is that better? Right? Murder has become what's good in his eyes. That didn't work. Story after story, we're waiting for someone to listen to God's voice, to offer up their life, to bring about this restoration, to silence the voice of that con artist, to silence the echo chamber in our own minds. Someone that will trust God enough. Because that's really at the root of this problem, isn't it? When I hear about Adam and Eve in the garden and the way in which they go about this and hearing them talk with this con artist, it's like they don't trust God to be good or trust God's interpretation of good, right? I feel like I'm a parent that's been put right into the situation. Anybody that's got kids or grandkids, you know what it's like. You're trying to guide them to what's good for their life because you know what's good for them. And they don't trust you, do they? They don't trust you at all. In our family, this happens all the time. My wife, Amanda, will ask our boys, right? She'll be giving them some instruction, something that's good for them, be kind to others, things like this. And she'll just be like, just trust me on this. Can you just trust me that I know what I'm talking about? And honest to heaven, sometimes those boys will just be like, nope, don't trust you. Is that not Adam and Eve here? Is that not other people in the Bible that won't lay down their life as God speaks his words that bring life to them? They're so convinced of this distorted view that they're like, no, I'm not going to trust you. I'm not going to trust that your words are actually going to bring life into me. I'm not going to trust that you know what's good for my flourishing, even though you created me. How do we deal with this problem? Who's going to offer up their life so that God can restore this life? This is where Jesus comes in. Jesus comes in as this con artist killer. Jesus comes in as that serpent crusher. Because it's not just that Jesus is doing it, but you finally have somebody that's so perfectly partnered with God that it's God himself doing something for humans that we couldn't do for ourselves. It's God becoming like us so that we can become like him, which is what he wanted in the very beginning. That's what Jesus is all about. And in fact, all of Jesus' teachings, his words, are about guiding us into this life that we can flourish in. That's what he's teaching the people. When Jesus does miracles, it's about restoring people back into a place like in the garden where they could flourish, giving sight to the blind so that they can see, helping people to walk so that they can work. He's healing diseases so people are fully restored into the humanity that God intended from the very beginning, and now they can flourish. This is what Jesus is teaching and he's doing with his miracles. It's God become like us so that we can become like him. And it also throws everyone right off the rails. Jesus knows that he's got to lay down his life so that we can have life. That he can restore that life of flourishing. That he can kill that con artist, that he can crush the head of that serpent. He's got to offer up his life. Last Sunday was Palm Sunday, the first day of the last week of Jesus' life. He intentionally is making his way to his death, to lay down his life. And people at first are cheering for him. They're celebrating this king, and in 5 days, by the time we hit Friday, they've turned on him. They don't like the way that he's going to be king. They don't like that he's trying to give them some kind of life because it looks like death to them. They want their own life, and so now they're saying, kill him. Kill him. Just like Cain did to Abel. Kill him. And Jesus lays down his life, not just because it's his best idea, but it's because he listens to the Father's voice. And he knows that the Father's voice brings life. He lays down his life. And he dies, and he's in the tomb. And 3 days later, that tomb is empty. The tomb is empty, signaling that he has defeated the con artist. The con artist thought he won because there he killed God's son. He can't bring in this restoration, and yet that empty tomb is the beginning of this new life. But sometimes it's hard for us to see it, let's be honest. How can death actually bring life? Sometimes we get such a distorted view that we live by from the words that we have heard people say to us, or we've said to them, or things that have happened, and we just live our life saying that we can live our life on our own. And we get so trapped in that way we can't see clearly. And that's what happens to this other woman named Mary when she enters the garden to meet with Jesus, God's own son. She has trouble seeing past the grief and the loss because Jesus has died. She can't see that he is alive again. It's a beautiful story. John chapter 20, starting in verse 11. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw 2 white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." So focused on Jesus' death, she can't see that maybe he's alive. The only thing that she could see has happened here is that somebody has stolen Jesus' body. That's the only thing that makes sense to her, because she can't picture that maybe Jesus actually did what he said he was going to do. That he actually put an end to that serpent, that con artist, and he's bringing in new life for her. This Mary is a Mary that she knows what it's like to be influenced by something from the outside. She had 7 demons that possessed her, and Jesus healed her, restored her back to the human being God intended her to be. Yet she can't see it, even though she's speaking with spiritual beings in a garden. She can't see it, even though she's going to hear and speak with Jesus, but can't fully see him. That's exactly what happens next. Verse 14, she turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." She's still focused that Jesus is dead. She can't recognize or put together that he's standing right in front of her. She doesn't trust what she has seen because it's so distorted. She's only focused on death. It's not until she actually hears the voice of God speak her name that all of a sudden she sees the life that he's offering to her. In the next verse, Jesus just says, "Mary," and all of a sudden, it all becomes clear to her. The voice of God is speaking your name today. He wants to give you this life to where you can flourish. Do you trust God to give you this life? Do you trust that God can give you a life greater than the life that you can get by yourself? Even though it feels like such a good life, That's what you're left with. Can you hear through the pages of this story in Scripture Jesus calling out your name, inviting you into this life that he wants to give you today? I hope your answer is yes, and not like my kids and just like, nope, don't trust God. I hope that you trust Jesus' words to give you life. Because if you do, that you get to experience this transformation from this distorted view that you have of the life that you want for yourself to the truth about the life that Jesus brings, like my many friends in this video right here.